Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. In this video, I have a slight migraine. Please be patient with me. I need to have a lot of caffeine. Okay, so in this video, I want to talk about how there's different influence in the Quran from other religious texts. Now, as I've mentioned in previous videos, you guys know that there is quite a lot of influence in the Quran from prior scriptures or things that people may have considered scriptures at some point, and also things that were probably never considered scripture. So we have the Gospel of Thomas that ultimately seems to make its way into the Quran through the Syriac infancy Gospels, the Proto-Evangelion of James, you can find that there, and also the Syriac Alexander legends seem to also find their way there. But something I haven't mentioned before is that you can actually find evidence of Paul. No, not that Paul, definitely not that Paul, but Paul of Tarsus actually seems to have his writings in the Quran. Spicy, I know, but stay with me. Now you might say, Chris, I know what Muslims say. They don't like Paul. They think he's a bad guy. There's no way that Paul's going to be in the Quran. Well, actually, you'd be surprised. It turns out that, well, first of all, the idea of Paul being a bad person, I think actually wasn't around in the early Ummah, the early Islamic communities, but rather was a later development, partly in response to their engagement with Trinitarian Christianity. You know, the whole, oh, the Trinity is bad. We don't like the Trinity, but you affirm the Injil. Oh, Paul corrupted all the Injil. Paul did it. Blame Paul. This is basically that's the idea. You just blame Paul, it's all good. But ignoring that, let's take a look at the first example I have. Let's take a look at what the Quran says in Surah 32, Ayah 17. We read the following. And no soul knows what has been hidden for them of comfort for eyes, i.e. satisfaction, as reward for what they used to do. So this is talking about, in context, the rewards that Muslims can look forward to in Jannah, in paradise, when they ultimately give up the ghost and they go to be in Jannah for all eternity. The idea being is that, well, you have no idea what kind of rewards and joys are awaiting you for when you do go to paradise. Seems fair enough. Now let's contrast this with 1 Corinthians. And I'm going to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 9, where we read the following. However, as it is written, what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, and what no human mind has conceived, the things God has prepared for those who love him. Now in the context here, it's very similar. It's talking about what the faithful believer has to await them when they enter into paradise after they die. What's interesting is Paul is actually quoting Isaiah here. He's quoting Isaiah 64, verse 4. But he's put his own paraphrasing into this. It isn't a direct quote. He's just taking it as influence in his own writings. So it's not a direct one-to-one quote, but rather it's more appropriate to say it's paraphrase. Now, obviously, what Paul says here, what the Quran say, yeah, they share some common aspects. You know, they're both talking about the same thing, what the believer has to await for him in the afterlife, and how no one knows that yet, and no one can comprehend it yet. It's only something you're going to know when you get there. Okay, fine. But that isn't enough to say that it's a quote or anything, or a paraphrase, or it's been influenced by the text. That's nowhere near enough. But wait, it gets a little weirder, and it gets a little it gets more interesting. Let's take a look at what a popular Hadith Qudsi has to say about this. Now, Hadith Qudsi is a hadith in which Allah has said something to Muhammad, and Muhammad narrates it, quoting that he got this from Allah. So in other words, rather than just being a narration of a tradition or a saying of Muhammad is directly attributing this to Allah, who has supposedly, through Jibreel, given it to him. Now, this is quite a popular hadith, and you can find it in many different books, and it's almost always sahih in these different variants, because there are variants of it. You know, hadith always have variants. But I'm going to go with the Al-Bukhari one, because Al-Bukhari is the best. I'm going to quote from there. So we read. This is in Sahih al-Bukhari 4780. Narrated Abu Hurairah. The Prophet said, Allah said, again this is Allah's words, I have prepared for my pious worshippers such things as no eye has ever seen, no ear has ever heard of, and nobody has ever thought of. That sounds like pretty much the same formulation that Paul wrote in his letter in 1 Corinthians. No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no one has conceived this or thought of this. There's a lot of parallels there. But maybe this is like something else. It isn't actually related to this verse in Surah 32, Ayah 17. Maybe it's just a hadith about some other concept that just happens to overlap. Well, let's keep reading. All that is reserved, besides which, all that you have seen is nothing. Then he recited, no soul knows what is kept hidden in reserve for them of joy as a reward for what they used to do. Surah 32, Ayah 17. So this is actually giving the occasion for revelation. It's talking about how Allah said something to Muhammad, and after this, presumably, the actual verse in 32, Ayah 17 comes about. Which is very weird how Allah happened to be very closely quoting, or at least paraphrasing, First Corinthians. Isn't that kind of weird? Now you might say to me, okay, Chris, you know what? Fine. It looks like it's influenced by some writing in First Corinthians. Yes, it does match what Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 verse 9, a little bit closer than it does Isaiah 64 verse 4. But that's just coincidence. It's not enough to make that kind of connection. And fair play, these things can happen. But that's not all though. That's just one. Let's take a look at another example that happens to quote seemingly from that very same letter, 1 Corinthians, in the Quran. And I'm not the only one who's noticed this. In fact, it seems to be the case that other scholars have also seen this and thought that perhaps this is drawing influence from Paul's writings, in this case, 1 Corinthians. Let's take a look at what Dr. Gabriel Reynolds has to say about this. Take it away, Gabriel.
Okay, here we have another example from Paul's letters about in this case, a different topic. It's intriguing that Paul's letters are alluded to in the Quran. So look at this in Quran 32, verse 17. No soul knows what comfort is laid up for them secretly as a recompense for what they were doing. I suggest, and I'm not the first to do so, that this is connected to 1 Corinthians 2:9. Again, Paul, where he says, as it is written, what no eye has seen, no ear heard, nor the heart of man conceive what God has prepared for those who love him. Very intriguing. The correspondence is not exact, but similar to the previous example, here the Quran is doing something very similar that the Bible is doing, or Paul in 1 Corinthians, namely using a turn of phrase about people not knowing the nature of God's reward in heaven. This is sort of mysterious. But in both cases, it's about reward in heaven. And there's this affirmation that no one can truly know, and it's implied how glorious, how wonderful, how pleasant the reward is in heaven. Just want to note that there is a Hadith Qudsi. Many will know that Hadith Qudsi is a declaration of God in Islamic tradition, not in the Quran, but preserved in Hadith collections. So most Hadith are either an eyewitness reporting most Hadith are an eyewitness reporting either what Muhammad has said or Muhammad has done. But the Hadith Qudsi is a special genre, which is a divine declaration, but not in the Quran, preserved in Hadith collections. Anyway, there's a Hadith Qudsi, which follows 1 Corinthians 2:9 much more closely, which seems, in fact, to almost verbatim repeat 1 Corinthians. There's a good article that's been written about this. I just note, this is really a side note, not on the topic of the biblical turns of phrase in the Quran, but you'll see that 1 Corinthians says, as it is written, and biblical scholars have a big debate about what is actually being quoted here. There's some Old Testament material which is sort of close. Others think maybe Paul is not alluding to an earlier version of the saying in the Old Testament, but somewhere else. Okay, on we go.
Now let's take a look at our next example in Quran chapter 16, verse 77. We read the following. And to Allah belongs the unseen aspects of the heavens and the earth. And the command for the hour is not but as a glance of the eye, or even nearer. Indeed, Allah is over all things competent. So what does this mean in context? Well, it's talking about the hour, the day of reckoning, the day of judgment, when that is to come to us as humanity. And the way that it's described in the Quran is like a twinkling of the eye. Now here the translation says glance of the eye, but if we look at the transliteration here, we can see quite clearly it says a twinkling of the eye. That's an interesting way of describing the hour. Funny enough, that seems to remind me of something Paul said in 1 Corinthians. Let's take a look. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 51 to 52, we read the following. Listen, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed. In a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. Again here, Paul is talking about the same thing. He's talking about the hour to come, the day of reckoning, the day of judgment. He describes it using the same phrase, a twinkling of an eye. So we have the same context and the same terms of phrase being used. Let's see what Gabriel Reynolds has to say. Take it away, Gabriel Reynolds.
There's this nice phrase in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, his first letter to Corinthians, in which he speaks of eschatology that is what will happen at the end of our lives or at the end of the world. And he speaks of everything will happen very quickly. And the expression he uses in Greek for very quickly is en ripe ophthalamu. And in Syriac, it's rafaf aina. And both of these basically mean the blinking of an eye. But I think King James, it's from the King James version, that everyone in most Bible translations like to speak of twinkling of an eye. Again, someone can help me if I've gotten something off there in the comment section. But we find in Quran 16 the phrase lamhil basar, used also for the eschaton, so for the last moment or the hour. And that's what makes me think there's probably a connection here, that something will happen as quick as lamhil basar, which is like something happening as quick as enripe ofthalmu or rafaf aina. Nevertheless, just to note, the Arabic lamh al-basar does not really mean twinkling. It doesn't even mean blinking, if we're to use a more literal rendition of Paul's turn of phrase there. But it means a quick glance, probably. So maybe it just seems similar, but it's not similar. I'll let people offer their own opinions on that.
So that's two occasions in the same letter that the Quran seems to be drawing inspiration from. You would have thought if Paul was such a negative, bad force on the world and contrary to Allah's plan, that Allah would make sure he doesn't end up quoting him. But apparently that's not the intention that Allah has when he revealed the Quran. Now, is that all? No, it isn't. There's more. Now we're going to go outside of 1 Corinthians. We're going to look at another one of Paul's letters. We're going to look at the letter to the Galatians. But first, let's read the Quran verse associated with it. Let's go to Quran chapter 49, verse 12. O you who have believed, avoid much negative assumption. Indeed, some assumption is sin. And do not spy or backbite each other. Would one of you like to eat the flesh of his dead? Would one of you like to eat the flesh of his brother when dead? You would detest it, for Allah, indeed Allah, is accepting of repentance and merciful. So this is a clear commandment to not backbite. It is to not go against one another, to stab one another in the back, to form rivalries, and to hurt each other, rather than working towards good. And the particular phrase the Quran uses here, which is interesting, is eating of the flesh of your brother, or more specifically, eating of the flesh of your dead brother. That's a very particular phrase, an interesting way of putting it. We read in the Epistle to the Galatians, chapter 5, verse 13 to 15, it says the following. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use the freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command, love your neighbor as yourself. If you bite and devour each other, watch out or you will be destroyed by each other. Now that phrase there, if you bite and devour each other, is in context of brothers and sisters in the faith, in the same way it is in context in the Quran to brothers and sisters in the faith. But what's interesting here is that the actual term devour in the Syriac translation is more plainly read as just eat. So if you bite and eat each other, which is a very unique and specific analogy given to describe the act of betraying or going against your brother, potentially trying to cause rivalries and harm and petty actions towards one another. And once again, this isn't just me saying this, but rather that scholars say this. Take it away once more, Gabriel Reynolds.
Okay. On to maybe a strange one. Many viewers perhaps would have been familiar with some of the examples that I've given thus far for biblical turns of phrase. But look what you find in Quran 49. Do not spy on one another or backbite. Will any of you love to eat the flesh of his dead brother? يَأْكُلُ لَحْمَ أَخِيهِ مَيْتًا. You would hate it. So that's an interesting expression and a way of alluding to spying or backbiting, betraying someone, speaking bad about someone outside of their presence. Something like that is equivalent to eating the dead flesh of one's brother. Where could that come from? Why would the Quran use this turn of phrase? Well, it's possible it comes from Galatians. So GAL, there's an abbreviation for Paul's letter to the Galatians, where you can read through the bit there. Where it speaks of the law being fulfilled in loving, the love of a neighbor. And then Paul goes on and says, but if you bite and devour, and in the Syriac translation, notably, the cognate of yekula, which is klitun, is used. So, but if you bite and eat one another, take heed that you are not consumed by one another. So I think this is pretty close. I think this is probably a true biblical turn of phrase picked up in the Quran.
Now I'm going to share Gabriel's video in the description below because it's one of these videos I think actually is quite profound in demonstrating there does seem to be quite clear influence of the Pauline letters in the Quran, at least in terms of the language the Quran uses when it describes certain topics, because, well, Paul already used that language to describe those same topics hundreds of years prior. We also know that the Quran has no issue affirming particular scriptures that it feels it doesn't need to specify what they are. Whatever was around at that time in Arabia, that's good enough as far as the Quran is concerned. So could the Pauline letters have made the way to Arabia? Possibly. Probably through oral tradition rather than a written tradition, but seems like that's a real thing that could have happened. And it would explain why the Quran seems to be borrowing or at least influenced by these particular terms of phrase that seem to either originate or have become popular through Paul. Now, Gabriel Reynolds actually gives some more examples, which are really interesting. He talks really well about uncircumcised hearts, and he compares that terminology that you find in the Old Testament and in the New Testament through Paul, and how the Quran seems to be borrowing that. So some really interesting stuff. Definitely check his video out. I find that really interesting. So, Muslims, the next time you say that Paul is a bad guy, he corrupted Jesus' original message, he came up with the Trinity somehow, or maybe he didn't, but either way, he definitely didn't believe what Isa said, and he is not a reliable source, then you may have to address why the Quran seems to think he's reliable enough to actually quote him when it comes to the kinds of languages and terms that he used in his own letters and is now being used in the Quran. And perhaps to end on this question, Muslims, if you don't think that Paul's writings are valid scripture, why is it that the Quran seems to be influenced by them? And what basis do you have to eliminate Paul's letters from the possible canon that the Quran assumes the people at its time are familiar with and says is valid? How do you know it's not part of that? How do you know Paul's letters were not considered as part of the Injil, for example? These are questions I think Muslims, you would have a difficult time answering, because the Quran simply doesn't give you this kind of knowledge. It assumes those people at the time who historically probably were familiar with some of Paul's letters, it assumes that those people, they've got it right. And it's up to you to show otherwise. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, hope you find this interesting like I did. If you're not a Christian, then today is the day. You can email me at chrisatspeakerscorner@gmail.com. And now I actually have the email in my videos, because that would have been a clever thing to do before. And I wish you all a blessed day. God bless. Take care.